Good morning, Vietnam. Here I am back again for my 25th or so video. Thoroughly enjoying it and doing and talking about, researching all the topics I've been really interested in. And today we're going to start a 4-part series on something that's very close, dear to me and has affected me my whole adult life. And that is childhood trauma. But we're going to start with, as I said, a 4-part episode on Dr. Gabor Maté. And I have titled this, Dr. Gabor Maté, Where Are You Leading Us? And this is part 1. Now you can just watch part 4 when I release it. It is the most condensed version of his theories about childhood trauma and how they affect our lives today and how to resolve things that are due and caused by childhood trauma. But each part is on its own worth, I believe, listening to and watching and reading the text, which I'll either attach or put it in as a separate video. I have a very long introduction. But first I want to say that I am, and have said before on another video, that I'm a huge fan of Dr. Mate. I have read his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and I did hear him lecture good 25 years ago in Los Angeles on the book. And mainly that book deals with drug addiction and how sexual childhood trauma is the main cause of drug addiction. And he has spent well over a decade in a clinic in Vancouver where he opened, I don't know how many, but legal places where you can go and take your drug, shoot up. And he was challenged by the government there 3 or 4 times, and he had to take the case all the way to the Supreme Court, and he won every case. And we can really thank him for that. One of the stories in that particular book is that the research was done on US Army vets returning from the Vietnam War, where they were taking a lot of drugs to deal with the stress of being in combat, and they took them a lot apparently. But on their return from their tour of duties as well, they stopped taking the drugs. And as he points out, it's not the drugs themselves, it's the situation or the stress you're under at any time, whether or not you'll end up taking drugs. I'm not going to get into all those reasons today. My concern with this 4-part episode on Dr. Mate is his theory, which he has extended from his original ideas and conclusions that he reached from doing the clinic on drug addiction in Vancouver. Anyway, Dr. Mate. You can read my notes, as I said, later. Talked about all this. Now, my conclusion in the end summarizes how I feel about Dr. Mate's theories, and to show you and to show anybody that I've got to at least look at his videos and do transcripts of his videos and comment on them and show clearly why I know and prove that his theory is wrong fully and in some parts. In many parts he is correct. He makes statements that I totally agree with. But his overall conclusion is there's no basis for it. It's just how he feels about it. Because he's not an expert in psychology whatsoever. So, why should you listen to me? Again, I am going to be critical of Dr. Mate purely on my own background, my own experiences. My brother is actually mentally ill. I've been through hell and high water with him and with his psychiatrists, psychologists, and the institutions he's been locked up in. So I do have a lot of contact with mental illness. And of course my own personal childhood traumatic experiences. The other experience I have is I did do a psychological therapy which does specialize in childhood trauma, how to overcome it, or at least be able to live with it, how to deal with it, how to recognize how it affects your current life, how it has affected your previous life, and how it may affect you in the future. Now, this particular therapy worked for me. There are numerous therapies. You can go see many types of psychiatrists, psychologists, family doctors, family therapists. I have seen, with my first girlfriend in the US, a Freudian psychiatrist. I couldn't wait to get out of there. I mean, the guy was just stupid. I'm sorry. He sat in his gloomy office, everything dark. He thought he was Sigmund Freud. Had his pipes, the whole lock, stock and barrel. And then the second therapy session I had with my last girlfriend, wife, whatever, in the US, was a family therapist, and he couldn't get her to see almost anything negative about herself. So he failed miserably also. Anyway, this particular therapy, as I said, worked for me. I'm going to go into, I mentioned it during these 4 videos, but also at the end of it I'm going to do my own personal account of my experiences of my own mental health and my own personal childhood trauma experiences and how I've dealt with them and how this therapy has helped me. You must find your own therapy. That is key. You must find out what really works for you. There's many different types, and you have to work out which one will help you find peace of mind, some happiness in your life. And happiness is such a strange word to talk about your life. Somebody told me many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, that life is just a collection of happy times. And I really, really believe that. I can honestly say I've had 10 really great personal happy experiences in my life. The rest is just hard work. So in the early, late 70s, well, mid 70s to mid 80s, I came across a book that somebody gave me, and it was called The Primal Therapy. As I said, I refer to it throughout the 4 videos, and later we'll talk about it in detail on my own personal account of this therapy. But there was also odd therapies at the time. One was called Rolfing. It was developed by a Dr. Rolf, which basically you've got a massage by a number of people at the same time and try to force your traumatic experiences out of you. The other one was called birthing or rebirthing therapy. And the idea behind that was that you would try to re-experience your birth, and in somehow that will help you deal with your childhood traumas. But you can do all your own research on those. I had really zero interest in those therapies, again, other than primal therapy, because after I read the book, everything made sense to me. So the first video I'm going to discuss of Dr. Gabor Mate's is how childhood trauma leads to addiction, which in fact he has written extensively and is quite an expert on partially that topic. This is the best video where he discusses the two basic needs that are required to grow up healthy, what he has termed attachment and authenticity. The other videos I attach in this particular video, at the end of this video, 3 videos. I've watched about 10 of his videos and got very upset, and that's why I'm doing this. But anyway, one of them that I've attached at the end is called The Best Explanation of Addiction I've Ever Heard. So, now, all these transcripts I have done on each of these videos, his train of thought is quite meandering, and I have tried to repair the grammar to make it readable, lucid, intelligible, and to follow the logic of his theory, which he's trying to convey, because I've watched so many of his videos and I do know, I think, quite a bit about childhood trauma and how it affects you and what I believe how to resolve it. So the transcript is self-explanatory. You can watch and hear the videos. I'm not going to read it, it's too long. But in this particular one, he starts off with talking about addiction. I'm quoting, so craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. That's true. That's what drugs do. I've taken some drugs in my life. Now notice I said nothing about substances. I said any behavior, which goes back to the Vietnam War vets, how they did not take drugs once they were out of the stressful situation. As I said, any behavior, so it could be related to cocaine, meth, heroin, fentanyl, any drug, anyway. Sex, gambling, shopping, eating, extreme sports, pornography. Now he goes on. So I said any behavior. So the American Society, according to medicine, is that it is primary, that it's a primary brain disorder. Well, I'm not sure about the disorder part. I think that childhood addiction definitely creates self-defense mechanisms when you're experiencing some trauma, especially when you're young and your brain is not developed. It can't absorb it, it doesn't understand it, and it's trying to protect you from the damage your parents are causing you at that time. Quoting, the other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice. Of course, he's correct, it's not a choice. And he writes correctly, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing What are we punishing them for? And although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, well, as I write, it is also true, but it's not a mental disorder, as I just said. A brain disorder cannot be the same as your brain shutting down and unable to absorb, comprehend what is happening to you at a young age. It goes on, I don't see it as a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So he goes on, if that's okay, a human being has two fundamental needs. Apart from the physical needs in infancy, which I assume he means to feed, clothe, and have a roof over your head. In infancy, in childhood, one is for attachment. So this is the first time he mentions the word attachment, and he explains it this way. Now, attachment is the closest proximity with another human being for the sake of being looked after or for the sake of looking after the other human beings. And I write, this is the first mention of this term here, but he actually developed this terminology theory about a year earlier. And because I didn't really particularly like that video, I preferred this one much more, I've attached it at the end of this video. It's called authenticity versus attachment. Now, he is using the word attachment to simply mean we cannot survive without our parents. I mean, that is so logical that this is where, Dr.Mate loses me in so much of it, the way he thinks and he postulates about his theory on how to resolve, cure, and about childhood trauma. Anyway, and he goes on about mammals after being born, and I write, humans need the longest time to be nurtured. I postulate, but maybe this is why we are, or can be so traumatized. We need our parents around us for many years and to love us unconditionally for that time. As human beings, we need our parents basically till we're at least 16. It's pretty hard to go out and get a job and live on your own before you're 16. So we need our parents to help us stay alive. So anyway, we'll get to more of his attachment later. He goes on about birds and then, okay. Quoting him, one of these things is that the endorphins, which the human body's internal opiate chemicals, which heroin and all the other opiates resemble, they have to facilitate attachment. I'm not following the logic, so quoting him again, so if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors, so they don't have endorphin opiate activity in their brain, they won't cry for help and separate from their mothers, which would mean that they would die in the wild. Yes, humans would die in the wild at 5, 8, 10 years old. You can almost guarantee it. As I said, you would need to be 16 at least to be able to survive just in a city. So I don't know why he gets into this, how your brain is developing endorphins, and I assume the connections he's making is that we take these drugs because it takes us back to a place where it feels like we are making these endorphins in our brains, and therefore it makes us feel good. So it takes us back to a happier time when our parents were not abusing us. Well, it's as good as any, because he does not explain it, except in this way, which goes back to what happens in early childhood when there's stress and where there is, I guess, stress and trauma. These endorphin systems don't develop, and then when people do heroin, it feels like warm, soft hug to them, just as I postulated just then. But it may not necessarily be the first time. It may be a time, all the time, where they did not get the hug, if you're talking about just the hug. So it's, I think, way more complicated than what he just mentions. Now he goes on more about it. Attachment, we cannot survive without it, etc., etc. Yes, we know. Now, quoting, but we have another need, which is authenticity. Now authenticity, auto-self, means being connected to ourselves, just knowing what we feel and being able to act on it. I'll get to what he's talking about. So he goes on and on that we need to live in cities, in houses. We don't live in the wild anymore, and we need our gut feelings. So if you're stuck in the wild as an adult and trying to survive, then he quotes, if you start using your intellect instead of your gut feelings, you just don't survive. But if you're raised in the city anyway, you have no gut feelings of survival in the wild anyway. You're going to more or less die unless you somehow work out which are the correct plants to eat. There was a book that came out, I don't know, over 20 years ago, which I read, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. You may know it. It's called Into the Wild. And I'll sidetrack for a minute. First of all, the guy who wrote it, I really, really like. I can't think of his name. But he wrote about this young kid. And this is all about, interestingly enough, childhood trauma. The young kid, he just couldn't take living around his parents anymore. And he worked and saved his money, and he went off to Alaska. And he bought a bus, whatever, and he drove, I believe he drove up there. This is a true story. And he was surviving off the land, I mean, barely. I mean, he had like I can't recall, a sack of wheat or a sack of rice or something. And he was eating plants. And one of the plants he ate resembled a plant that he thought he knew that he could eat. But it turns out the plant was poisonous and he died. So if you're raised in the city, you're going to die in the wild. And to go back to that author, he was a rock climber. And I remember him talking about his own experiences within this book and the massive connection he made about how he felt about his father and how he risked his life every time he mountain climbed. And it was all about trying to get love from his father. I will talk more about that later, about myself as well, but let's go back to his authenticity. The message you receive is not that good little kids don't get angry, but that angry little kids don't get loved. Well, I can't see why not, but he goes on. because your parents are now sullen, they won't look at you, they talk to you in a harsh way, you're not getting love, not experiencing love at the moment. No, but you've got to stay attached. Guess what you're going to suppress? Well, your feelings, of course. So I write, this is where he loses me, and has made up this theory. In my opinion, it is only the suppression of your emotions. You need to shut them down to deal with the pain of emotional overload, emotional negativity, emotional pain that your parents don't love you. Because we cannot assimilate that emotional hurt that we were going through at the time, he has transposed the word authenticity for feeling emotionally, or simply emotion, or simply shutting down your emotions. So, this is his second word. How he has taken the word attachment, just really from emotion. So he goes on about it more. Now he's going to try and talk about how to heal. We give up our authenticity, and then we wonder who the hell we are, whose life is this, and who's experienced all this and this life. And you don't know who you are. And where's the reconnection? Where the reconnection has to happen, that's what the healing happens, is when that reconnection. But because of that conflict, the tragic conflict in childhood between authenticity and attachment that most of us face, that we lose ourselves and lose connection to our gut feelings. Well, this is my comments. But how do you make that reconnection? I think for most of us, I'll correct that. For me, this is verbatim language that is taken from the book, The Primal Scream. I have read that book extensively, mind you, many, many years ago. I haven't touched it or seen a copy of it for probably 40 years. But it sounds like a lot of things that are written in The Primal Scream. So this is where I say his theories are not original. He's just changed the language and make it more adaptable, compatible to our modern sensibilities and how to sell yourself, become the new guru, the network guru, which I use later, that expression. So now he says, I say, this is such a logical, simple statement. Does it need to be said, theorized, or written about? No. Now this leads to the question, quoting Dr. Mate again, now this leads to the question of trauma, because it's one thing to recognize that all this originates in childhood pain. Yes, obviously. It is quite another to transform that pain, and for that we have to understand what trauma is. Okay, I think we know what trauma is. So he goes on, trauma is a divorce. When you're small and your parents fighting. Trauma is your mother's depression. Trauma is your father's alcoholism. Trauma is your parents' argumentation. Trauma is physical or sexual abuse or some loss. This is where he loses me. Suddenly he says, those are not the traumas. They are traumatic, but the trauma is not what happens to you. The trauma is what happens inside you. Okay? And as a result of these traumatic events, what happens inside you is you get disconnected from your emotions. Yes and no. And you're disconnected from your body. No. This traumatic experience is permanently there. You cannot cut it out. You cannot suddenly fish around with a fish hook and find it. as I say, you cannot cut it out metaphorically or physically. It's there permanently, and you have to somehow deal with it. And he goes on. And you have difficulty being in the present. Yes, because of your early childhood experience. Now, these experiences can, for different people, manifest itself in different ways, which I'll talk a bit later. He goes on. You end up having a negative view of the world, a negative view of yourself, yes, and a defensive view of other people, yes. He goes on, which becomes even more confusing. These perspectives keep showing up in your life, in the present. In other words, the addiction is not the primary problem. It's an attempt to solve a problem. Yes, maybe, but the question is how? Here he sidesteps the real issue again in all his videos when he gets to this point. How do you solve it? How do you connect to that childhood trauma? How is it affecting your life? How are you going to stop it or ameliorate it or chip away at it slowly? He goes on. And then the real question is, how did the problem arise? Well, we know how it arose. In other words, this is where my theory is, that it's always rooted in childhood trauma, and that the addiction is an attempt to deal with the effects of childhood trauma. Okay? Which it does temporarily, yes. And it creates more problems in the long term, yes. So the issue is not just to recognize what happened 10, 15 or 30 years ago, however many years ago, but to actually recognize their manifestations in the present moment. Okay, but how? He writes, and to transcend them. But how? And already do that by reconnecting with yourself, by restoring the connection with your body primarily. What a moron, what an idiot. Mate, come on. There's no logic to it. How does that knowing connection, restoring this connection, going to change anything? How do you change? What is the mechanism to change? He goes on, and with your emotions that you lost. You haven't lost them. What emotions are you talking about you lose? You haven't lost any emotions. You still have all the emotions you grew up with. It's a traumatic experience that allowed you to shut down and make all these bad, mediocre, so-so decisions in your life. If the trauma is so bad, especially sexual trauma, you become an addict. And that is your specialty, Dr. Mate. Once you do, when you found these things again, then you have what we call recovery. Wow! I just remembered my father looking at me like he was going to kill me. Well, I'm recovered. That's what it is. I remembered. Therefore, I'm recovered. What emotion did I lose? Yeah, I was petrified. I'm still very in fear of my father, and I mentioned in this video later how he totally traumatized me growing up through fear because he was such a big, powerful man. And even if he wasn't, when you're 5, 6, 8, 10 years old, what are you going to do? Beat your father up? As I write, remembering something is not recovery. It is just remembering. He goes on finally, because what does it mean to recover something? It means to find it again. Okay, so I remember it. He goes on, so what does the people find when they recover? They find themselves. And the loss of self is the essence of trauma. So the real purpose of addiction treatment, mental health treatment, any kind of healing is reconnection with you. Well, that's his solution. Recovery, reconnection, you're cured. That's it, it's over. What else do you need in life? You have found yourself. Well, I'm just going to find the perfect girlfriend, wife now. After all the mistakes I've made picking women. Wow! What did I think of that? My conclusion, this is so pathetic and such a childish solution, simplistic to the hilt, a total cop-out. To summarize all his solutions to childhood trauma is simply by remembering your trauma. If it were that easy, why are we all, the whole planet, still so traumatized? In the end, it does not even get close to prove his original statement, how childhood trauma leads to addiction. Now, he can prove to us, by case studies he has done again and again and again, how sexual childhood trauma has led to drug addiction. But there's no way he has proven in this document, this video at least, and my transcript of what he said, that childhood trauma leads to addiction. Well, let me think. My addiction is I pick bad women. Well, I'll correct that. I pick women that I have to take care of. I have to pick women that I have to spend, half of my life savings I've spent almost on them. Okay, well, I don't think it's an addiction to women. I don't think it's an addiction to throwing money away. The trauma has not allowed me to, in whatever way, and which trauma am I talking about, I don't know, because obviously everyone has more than one traumatic experience growing up. So what traumatic experience has made me pick women like this, spend a small fortune on every one of them, almost every one of them, or pick women that totally rip me off, like one of my ex-girlfriends here, and my second wife in LA, totally ripped me off. Okay, this video is his earliest video on this topic, and his introduction to this field of childhood trauma, well beyond sexual childhood trauma that has led to drug addiction. He's been able to find a niche in this never-ending battle for humans to answer the eternal questions of life. Who are we? How do we get here? Why are we here? How do we become so traumatized? And how to get rid of that trauma. And for Dr. Mate, how to be happy and or how to release ourselves from childhood trauma. Well, he doesn't know, that's for sure. He has so many videos on this topic. Just read the headlines, but beware of his logic, wording, and conclusions, as they are inherently very weak and in the end false. Now, just a little bit, I've written more on under the heading, my more personal conclusions. As I said, I will add, if you want to keep watching my videos about my critique of Dr. Mate and how I feel about him and what he's writing about, and generally about childhood trauma and how to deal with it. The problem is that he has taken almost all of this theory from the Primal Scream. I cannot say I'm an expert, but I did go to the Primal Institute in Los Angeles in 1980. I moved there specifically to do the therapy from Australia, as described in Arthur Janov's book and books. But he's critical one is the first one. The later ones get a little bit too technical on chemical imbalances in the brain and so forth. Spending 2 years visiting the Institute. Also after that, I was friends with many of the people who did go, I won't call them patients, to the Institute to help themselves get over and to get over childhood trauma, but also how to deal with childhood trauma and how it's affecting their, especially their current lives, and how to improve their lives, knowing what they do know about childhood trauma, especially after going to the Institute. So as I said, I was friends with many of the people who went there after the fact, and actually I'm not in contact with anyone that went there anymore. Anyway, so spending 2 years visiting the Institute, after doing the 2-week introductory crash course, and then following up with group sessions and occasionally private therapy sessions. Excuse me, the only difference between Dr. Mate's theory and primal therapy in this long video explanation is he introduces the terms attachment and authenticity. I've explained what I believe they mean to me, excuse me, to make it his idea and to make it more palpable in these simple words. His writings make it appear so simple, but as I mentioned many times, and also in my later videos and the assessment of Dr. Mate's writings and videos, he offers no solution how to resolve, move on, and how to change your current behavior if you believe it was caused by early childhood trauma. So following, as I said in the beginning of the video, that I've attached 3 videos. If you want to look at them, as I said, I've watched quite a lot of his, and I've watched these next 3 that I've attached, and you can look at them if you want more, if you want to study Mate's theories. First one is called Gabor Maté, Authenticity versus Attachment. It's put out in January 2020. It's probably the first one that came out with his explanation and his theory on using these 2 words. The next one is called The Best Explanation of Addiction I've Ever Heard. That came out January 21. And the last video, I'm just attaching the name, excuse me, is called Authenticity Can Heal Trauma. Now, I've written about this particular video. This video below came out quite late in February 2023 because my last video came out after this, and I've also done 2 other videos around this time as well, so I didn't need to do this one, critique this one. Anyway, I write, this video below came out after his book, The Myth of Normal. There are many videos in which he discusses this book. I have watched a little of this video, but I am not impressed. He has managed currently to cash in on his fame on addiction and subsequently the connection to childhood trauma to develop this whole theory, which is only an extension on what he believes and what he actually is an expert in. The introduction is only printed below. So that's it for my first video on Dr. Mate. Again, I am a huge fan of his, but in the last 5 years, I don't know where he's gone or why he's doing it. But he's definitely not an expert in childhood trauma relating to anything other than drug addiction. So I will do the second one. I await your comments. I hope you liked it, this one. And I will finish the next 3 because I'm very interested in this topic. And then finally I'll do one just on my own personal experiences. Thanks so much. See you in the next one.